They say silence is the heaviest sound that a person can carry. For George, 69 years old, it was the silence of a phone that never rang and two small faces he was not allowed to see. For a full year, his daughter Nancy erased him from her children's lives after a bitter argument over her new husband. But then, a padded envelope arrived from an elementary school, unsolicited, unexpected, broken by a second-grade teacher and a little girl who still writes grandpa from memory. George is a retired widower in Ohio who spent his life building quiet routines, not courtroom strategies. The drawing was from his 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily, a crayon stick figure with the word grandpa scrawled beneath. Her teacher found his address in the school file and included a note that Lily talks about him every single day. The question is not whether a little girl misses her grandfather. It is whether that piece of construction paper can survive a legal system designed to protect parents who want silence. The fight that took his grandchildren away began with a wedding and a stepfather who saw George as a threat. The fight that took his grandchildren away began with a wedding and a stepfather who saw George as a threat. Nancy had been a single mother for 4 years when she met Mark. Her first husband, the father of Lily and her younger brother Ethan, had walked out when Ethan was still an infant. George and his wife Ellen had stepped in to help raise those kids. Ellen was the one who taught Lily how to hold a crayon, how to draw the stick figures that would one day break a courtroom wide open. And when Ellen passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years ago, George became the anchor. Every Wednesday dinner, every Saturday morning at the park, every bedtime video call when Nancy was working late. He was not just grandpa. He was the steady heartbeat of a family that had already lost too many people. Then Nancy brought Mark to Sunday dinner. He was a financial planner, sharp suit, handshake like he had practiced it in a mirror. George didn't dislike him immediately. He tells people he doesn't have the energy for immediate dislike, but he noticed something. Mark kept referencing the way things should be, as though he had a blueprint for family that had never been discussed with anyone sitting at that table. Nancy was in love. George saw it in the way she relaxed around him, a tension lifting that she had carried since her divorce. He did not want to be the obstacle, but here is the thing about grandparent alienation. It rarely announces itself in a single explosion. It leaks in slowly, through comments disguised as concern. Mark started suggesting that the kids were getting too attached to old routines, that it wasn't healthy for Nancy to rely so heavily on a man in his late 60s, that a new family unit needed its own space to breathe. By the time Nancy told her father she was marrying Mark, the distance was already being measured. George stood at that wedding. He walked his daughter down the aisle, his jaw tight, his eyes wet for reasons that had nothing to do with joy. He gave a toast that was perfectly polite and perfectly hollow, and within 2 months of the honeymoon, the calls stopped being returned. The Saturday park visits were cancelled. Nancy's voice on the rare times she did pick up became clipped and rehearsed, as though someone was feeding her lines from across the room. Mark was building walls, and George was on the wrong side of them. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late summer. George had driven 40 miles to drop off birthday presents because the party he had not been invited to was happening the following weekend. He found Mark in the driveway, arms crossed, waiting. The conversation was short and cruel. Mark informed George that his presence was destabilizing the household, that the children needed consistency and authority, not interference from a man who could not accept that his daughter had formed a new family. The words were delivered in a calm, measured tone that somehow made them worse. George drove home with the presents still in the back seat, a wrapped picture book, and a stuffed bear that still smelled like his house because he had held onto them for 3 days hoping things might change. After that, the silence became absolute. No birthday calls, no Christmas, no explanation that the children could understand. George wrote letters. He sent cards to the house. Every one returned unopened. He called the school once, desperate, but was told they could not share information without parental consent. He contacted a family attorney who explained the brutal math of grandparent visitation rights, that a fit parent's decision is presumed to be in the child's best interest, and that challenging it would require proving substantial harm. At his age, on his fixed income, the odds were insurmountable. The system was not built for grandfathers. It was built to keep out the noise. For 365 days, George woke up alone in a house that still had a bedroom with 2 small beds never slept in. He stopped going to the garden center because he kept buying things he had no one to give to. He started sleeping in the living room because the quiet upstairs was too much. And then, on a morning that began indistinguishable from all the others, a second-grade teacher named Ms. Alvarez, in a classroom 40 miles away, handed out construction paper and crayons and asked her students a simple question. If you could write a letter to anyone in the world, anyone at all, who would it be? A 7-year-old girl did not hesitate. She wrote 2 words above a lopsided drawing of a tall man with gray hair. And when she folded that paper and sealed it in an envelope and painstakingly wrote her grandpa's address from memory, she had no way of knowing she was about to hand a grieving old man the only weapon that could crack a system designed to keep him silent. The envelope sat on George's kitchen table for nearly an hour before he opened it. He recognized the handwriting on the front, the wobbly uppercase letters that could only belong to a child just learning to hold a pen. The return address was Lincoln Elementary School. His hands, old and spotted with age, trembled as he slid his finger under the flap. Inside, a single sheet of manila construction paper, folded once. He opened it and saw 2 stick figures, one tall with gray squiggles for hair, one small with yellow crayon curls. They were holding hands. Above them, in green crayon, a word that George had not heard spoken aloud in a year. Grandpa. In the corner of the drawing, a lopsided heart. Beneath it, the teacher had attached a sticky note. Dear Mr. Callahan, we did a letter-writing exercise today. Lily asked to mail hers to you because she said you never got any of her drawings and she wanted to make sure this one reached you. She talks about you every day. I thought you should know. George covered his mouth with his hand. The teacher did not just send the drawing. She sent a message. A quiet, undeniable message that the silence had not erased him from the mind of that little girl. For the first time in a year, George did not feel powerless. He felt like a grandfather who had just been handed the truth in crayon. He called the school the next morning, not as a desperate old man, but as a man whose grandchild had reached out to him. He spoke to Ms. Alvarez, the second-grade teacher who had mailed the drawing. She was careful. She knew she was walking a line between professional obligation and human decency. But she told him that Lily had been drawing him for months, that when students were asked to write about their families, Lily always included an extra stick figure, that the little girl had once asked her, very quietly, if Grandma and Grandpa could still see you after they died, which meant she was thinking about the grandfather who was still alive, but absent from her life. Ms. Alvarez agreed to put her observations in writing. She said she would testify if it ever came to that. She had seen too many kids lose people who loved them without ever understanding why. Armed with the drawing, the sticky note, and the promise of a teacher's testimony, George went back to the attorney who had told him a year ago that his case was nearly unwinnable. The attorney was a woman named Janet Price, a family law specialist who had seen grandparents lose time and again. She looked at the drawing, she read the note, and she said something George had not expected. This is not a case about visitation. This is a case about harm, because under the law, a fit parent's decision about grandparent contact is presumed correct. But if you can demonstrate that cutting off a deeply bonded grandparent is causing emotional damage to the children, that presumption can be challenged. Lily's drawing, her daily talk about her grandfather, the teacher's observations that she was grieving a living man, this was not a sentimental artifact. This was evidence. Evidence that the estrangement was hurting a child. They filed a petition for grandparent visitation in family court. George named Nancy and Mark as respondents. He submitted the drawing. He submitted an affidavit from Ms. Alvarez. He submitted a psychological evaluation from a child therapist who had reviewed the file and agreed that sudden severance of a primary attachment figure could cause long-term anxiety and trust issues in young children. The petition landed in Nancy's hands like a live grenade. Mark read it first. His response was pure fury. He called George directly, the first communication in over a year, and the words were sharp enough to draw blood. He accused George of manipulation, of using a child's classroom exercise to mount a legal attack on a stable family. He said Lily was confused, that the drawing meant nothing, that a teacher had no business interfering. He threatened to file for a restraining order. George listened without interrupting and then said one sentence. "I'm not fighting you, Mark. I'm answering my granddaughter." The court set a hearing date. In the weeks leading up to it, George learned more about what had been happening inside the house he was locked out of. A neighbor who had been friendly with Ellen reached out. She told George that Lily had stopped playing outside, that Ethan, now 5 years old, had started wetting the bed, a regression that teachers at his preschool had flagged. That Nancy looked exhausted and thin, and that Mark's voice could be heard through the walls, not always yelling, but always in control. The picture that emerged was not of a happy new family unit. It was a household under tightening grip, and the children were showing the stress in the only ways children can. But here is the pivot that George's own attorney warned him about. A drawing and a teacher's note might get him in the courtroom, but winning would require something far harder. He would have to prove that Nancy was not acting in the children's best interest, that she had been coerced or was otherwise unfit to make the decision herself. And that meant George would have to stand in open court and argue, essentially, that his own daughter had failed her children. The legal strategy that gave him hope was also the one that risked destroying any chance of reconciliation. He would be forcing a confrontation between Lily's love and her mother's choices. The day before the hearing, George sat in his kitchen with the drawing propped up against the sugar bowl. He had framed it, a simple dark wood frame he found at a thrift store. He traced the crayon lines with his finger and made a promise to that stick-figure grandpa. He would walk into that courtroom and speak the truth his granddaughter had already spoken, whatever it cost. He did not know that Mark had arrived at court with a strategy of his own, one that would try to paint an old man's grief as obsession and a child's love as confusion. The first battle would not be over law, it would be over who gets to tell Lily's story. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled, the kind of room designed to process disputes rather than ease grief. George arrived early. He wore his best jacket, the one Ellen had picked out for their 40th anniversary, and he carried the framed drawing under his arm like it was a legal brief. Nancy and Mark were already seated at the respondent's table with their attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in a charcoal suit who looked at George as though he were a plaintiff slip-and-fall case, not a grandfather. Nancy did not meet his eyes. Mark leaned over and whispered something to her, and she nodded without expression, a gesture that looked, from across the room, like a door closing. The judge, a woman named Judge Carver, began the hearing by acknowledging the unusual nature of the evidence. She held up the crayon drawing, now entered as Exhibit A, and asked George's attorney to make her case. Janet Price walked the court through the timeline. 13 months of total exclusion after years of daily involvement. Birthday cards returned unopened. An elementary school teacher who broke protocol to mail a child's drawing because the child had been trying and failing to reach her grandfather. Ms. Alvarez was called first. She testified about the letter-writing exercise and the morning Lily had carefully written George's address from memory, how the little girl had explained that her mom said Grandpa was too busy to visit, but she wanted to send the letter anyway, just in case. Just in case. Those 3 words landed in the courtroom like a stone through glass. Judge Carver wrote something down. Mark's attorney cross-examined Ms. Alvarez with surgical precision. She suggested the teacher had overstepped, that a classroom exercise was not a clinical evaluation, that Lily might have been confused, that children draw all kinds of things, but Ms. Alvarez held firm. She added something she had not put in her affidavit. In the months since the letter exercise, Lily's drawings of her grandfather had changed. They used to show him smiling, holding her hand. Now she drew him smaller further away, and in the most recent drawing, the week before the hearing, the grandfather's stick figure had no face. She had erased it and not drawn it again. That was when George put his hand over his eyes. The prosecution of George Callahan, as his own attorney later described it, came next. Mark's attorney painted a picture of an old man who could not let go, who had inserted himself into a fragile new family dynamic and would not accept reasonable boundaries. She brought up the driveway confrontation, twisted it into a threat. She read from George's letters, highlighting phrases like "I won't stop trying" as evidence of harassment. The word obsession was used 3 times. George sat through it, his jaw working, but he did not speak until his turn on the stand. When he finally rose to take the oath, he brought the framed drawing with him and set it on the rail of the witness box, facing the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I am not here to take anything from my daughter. I am here because a 7-year-old child is drawing pictures of a grandfather who has no face. She is erasing me because someone told her to. I am not the one who told her." Then Janet Price called a witness that no one in the room except George had anticipated. The neighbor, the woman who had reached out weeks earlier, a retired nurse named Carol Simmons. She testified that she had known Lily and Ethan since they were Barbies, that she had watched them play in George's yard, that she had seen the change. She described hearing Ethan crying at night through the walls of the neighboring house. She described seeing Lily at the school bus stop, quieter, thinner, clutching a backpack with a keychain her grandfather had given her years ago. She described seeing Mark's car in the driveway at all hours and Nancy's car gone less and less. Mark's attorney objected to speculation, but Judge Carver allowed the testimony. The pattern emerging was not just about visitation denial, it was about isolation. The moment that shifted everything came not from a witness, but from Nancy herself. Her attorney had planned to keep her off the stand, but Judge Carver, after listening to Carol Simmons, addressed Nancy directly. She did not demand testimony. She simply asked if there was anything Nancy wished to say. Nancy stood up slowly. Mark reached for her arm, but she pulled away. She looked at her father for the first time in over a year, and she said 3 words that broke the siege. "I miss them." She meant the version of her children that existed when their grandfather was in their lives. She meant the version of herself. She told the court, her voice cracking, that she had believed she was protecting her marriage, that Mark had told her a clean break was necessary, that she had been afraid to disagree. She did not accuse him of abuse, but her words painted a clear picture of a woman who had traded one loss for another. Mark's expression in that moment was something George would later describe as all the proof he ever needed. Judge Carver recessed for less than an hour. When she returned, her ruling was direct. Grandparent visitation was granted, every other weekend, 1 evening a week, and phone calls Wednesday nights. She noted that the evidence did not prove parental unfitness, but that the emotional harm to the children was documented and substantial. She ordered the parties into family counseling and made it clear that any further interference by Mark with the visitation would result in sanctions. The drawing, she said, would remain in the court file, not as a relic, but as a reminder that children speak their own truth, and sometimes we are obligated to listen. George walked out of that courtroom with a legal order in his hand and a framed drawing pressed against his chest. Nancy stood by the elevators, not moving toward him, but not leaving either. Mark had already gone ahead, his attorney trailing after him with a face that said they would appeal. George did not approach his daughter. He simply looked at her and nodded once, a small, exhausted gesture that contained every dinner he had not been allowed to serve and every bedtime story he had not been allowed to read. The visitation was a victory, but victory in family court is never a clean thing. The real work, the work of learning to be a family again after all this damage, was about to begin, and the only map they had was drawn in green crayon. The first visit was scheduled for a Saturday at a neutral location, a playground halfway between George's house and the home he had been locked out of. George arrived 40 minutes early because he had been waiting a year, and 40 minutes felt like nothing. He sat on a bench under an oak tree, the framed drawing beside him, and watched the parking lot as though it were a horizon. When Nancy's car pulled in, his chest tightened for reasons that had nothing to do with his age. Lily got out first. She saw him across the playground, froze for exactly 2 seconds, and then ran. Not a walk, not a cautious approach, a full 7-year-old sprint that ended with her colliding into his legs and wrapping her arms around him so tightly that George later said he could feel his own heartbeat against her small chest. She did not say "Grandpa," she said "You came." Ethan, now 5 and more cautious by nature, held back. He stood beside his mother's car, one hand gripping the door handle, the other clutching a stuffed dinosaur George had given him years ago. The same stuffed dinosaur he had apparently kept through the long silence. George knelt down, not rushing, and simply opened his palm the way he used to when Ethan was a baby learning to walk. The boy took 4 slow steps, then broke into the same run his sister had. The 3 of them stood there, a small knot of bodies and tears on a public playground, while Nancy watched from the parking lot with her arms wrapped around herself. She did not approach, but she did not leave either. She sat on the hood of the car and let them have the hour. After that, the visitation became a rhythm. Every other Saturday, George would drive over with a cooler packed with sandwiches and apple slices and those little juice boxes the kids liked. He would take them to the park, to the library, to a diner where the waitress knew to bring extra crayons. He asked them questions and let them talk, not about the missing year, not about Mark, but about school and dinosaurs and the garden he was planting in their honor. Slowly, carefully, the silence of the previous year began to fill with ordinary noise. Lily stopped erasing his face from her drawings. The next one she gave him was of all 3 of them holding hands, and she had written "Grandpa is back" in blue crayon across the top. George framed that one too. The harder work happened between George and Nancy. They did not have a single dramatic conversation that fixed everything. They had a dozen small ones, on the phone after the kids were in bed, in the parking lot during visitation drop-offs, once in a coffee shop where neither of them touched their drinks. Nancy told him that Mark had made her believe the separation was temporary and necessary, that he had called her father overbearing, that she had gone along because she was terrified of losing a second marriage. She told him she was ashamed, not just of the estrangement, but of how long it took her children's own crayons to pull her out of it. George listened. He did not say, "I told you so." He said, "I have been waiting for this coffee for 13 months. It's cold now, but I'm drinking it." She laughed and cried at the same time, the way people do when relief and regret collide. Mark did not last in the house. 6 months after the court ruling, he moved out. The separation was quiet and final, the kind of departure that leaves behind a stillness where there used to be control. Nancy told her father that the hearing had cracked something open, not just legally, but inside her. Watching her own children run across a playground toward a man she had forbidden them to see, watching a teacher testify because she was more worried about a little girl's well-being than about her own liability, watching her father sit on a witness stand and refuse to be made into a villain. All of it had rearranged her understanding of what she had allowed. She began to rebuild. Slowly, imperfectly, the way families do. A year after the ruling, Lily's third-grade class had another letter-writing exercise. This time, she wrote directly to her grandfather without needing Ms. Alvarez to mail it in secret. She told him about her new room, about her mom's new job, about the fact that she had learned to ride a bike. She signed it, "Love, Lily, your granddaughter forever." George placed that letter alongside the first drawing in the frame above his desk. Two pieces of paper, one written in the dark of an enforced silence, one written in the light of a home that had found its way back. Anyone who visited his house and asked about the frame got the same answer from him. "That," he would say, pointing to the green crayon heart, "is the most important legal document I have ever owned." And he meant it, because a 7-year-old's construction paper heart had done what most adults never managed to do. It had told the truth and waited for someone to listen. George framed the evidence and never let a single day pass without looking at it. The story of George Callahan is not just one grandfather's fight. It is a window into a quiet epidemic that research shows affects 1 in 7 grandparents in this country. People who are erased from their grandchildren's lives, not by distance or death, but by the deliberate choice of a parent who has decided that silence is easier. What George discovered, what the drawing proved, is that silence is never a clean thing. It leaks. It shows up in a child's schoolwork, in a regression at preschool, in the erasing of a stick figure's face. The law, as it stands, assumes a fit parent knows best. That assumption protects families in many cases, but it also creates a burden that is almost impossible for a grieving grandparent to carry. Without that piece of construction paper, without a teacher willing to risk her job to mail it, George would still be sitting in his empty house waiting for a phone call that never came. The system was not built for him. Lily built a door where the system had put a wall. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone you know who carries a loss like this, do us one quick favor and subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever hitting that button, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit like, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear that a crayon drawing can still change everything. Thank you, genuinely. And remember, the people in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. Some of them just needed a 7-year-old to show them how.